Welcome to Clips, a quick review of facts or factoids taken from our more in-depth videos. Today, we get to once again revisit the Italian Bodeo revolver and, in this case, its precursor, the Chamelot-Delvigne. You see, in doing research for those episodes, I actually stumbled on something that I found to be particularly interesting, but it was kind of unrelated to the core story. Ever since, I've kept my eyes peeled, and I'm happy to say that thanks to some help from my friends, Ian over at Misremembered Shoot'ems, and our own Discord mod, Billy, I managed to lock down two very unusual pieces to show you. Let's take a look. This is the Italian 1874 Chamelot-Delvigne, an imported French design. But let's just do a quick review. We have our own episode. However, I want you guys to know vague parts count and how it works. So we've got trigger spring, sear spring, hammer spring, hand spring, which also works on the strut. So at least there's one dual purpose spring. This is a single action. So cock it back and locks on the sear, push the trigger to tip the sear, and boom, it would go bang, right? Double action, which is where the strut comes in especially, because if we start pushing that trigger, the strut's going to push the hammer back until it slips past, and then it will fall. Boom. If I let the hammer fall all the way as if it went bang, you'll notice that it's all the way down. I have to manually rebound that hammer, especially if I want to load the gun. And to do so, I'll open the gate, and I'll have to manually turn the cylinder because there is no disconnection system like you'd see on an Abity. If I pull that trigger, yep, that hammer's still in play. A fold under ejector with its own channel over here. You guys get the idea. We have a whole video on this gun. It would be replaced by this little guy, the Bodeo 1889, which is a much simpler and yet safer mechanism. Let's find out why. We have a folding trigger, which is not always the case. You could also have a solid version. We have a hammer, hand. We have a nose attached to the hammer. That's part of the double action system. And then we have a big old V-spring. And we have a little V-spring down inside for the nose. And that's really it. So much simpler overall, and yet single action, which is an extension on the hammer, catching an extension on the trigger, push to slip by, boom. Or double action, in which that same trigger extension hits the nose until it slips by, and then she falls, boom. And you may notice when I let go of this trigger, our hammer rebounded. That's pretty cool. It does it all on its own. In addition, we have one extra part here that was added later. This is a hammer block, which unless you pull the trigger to raise the hand, the hammer cannot be bashed into the firing pin by accident, or into the primer by accident, rather. So this gun has a lot of extra features right off the gate from the Chamelot-Delvigne, but it goes a little bit further in that we have an Abity gate loading system. So if we open that up, it disconnects the nose and hammer, and therefore we can just pull the trigger, and each time it will align that chamber with the ejection path. The ejector itself is like a Perrin revolver. It sits down in the arbor, and then it's aligned to push, eject, pull, push, eject. You get the idea. I've covered this gun and the Chamelot-Delvigne in detail before. But I wanted to show you something that gets a little wilder than either of those two guns, and you have to understand them both to see what I mean. This is a hybrid that we've covered before, externally a Chamelot-Delvigne because it started its life as a Chamelot-Delvigne. And yet, the Italian Navy, who had stuck with the Chamelot-Delvigne for a little while, eventually needed parts, and it was easier to refit them to take Bodeo components than it was to manufacture all new parts over and over and over again, especially because they got some added advantages to having the simpler system. So they put in a plug, they fitted the Bodeo parts, and boom, we have a Chamlo turned Bodeo. They kept the ejection system, they kept the arbor retainer, they kept all that stuff. And so you have this weird hybrid where you have the Abity system. Let me pull that trigger for you. You can see that my hammer twitches a bit, which is a little uncomfortable, but it's not actually going to strike anything. We have the Abity system. There we go. And yet, it doesn't quite align with the feed path or ejection path. So it's still not quite great. It's more of a safety system than it is a quick load and unload system on this particular gun. The hybrid system didn't work quite perfect enough, but this got the job done, and it's an interesting conversion. It's an interesting hybrid between the two, right? Well, eventually another government organization wants the Bodeo, all right? This would be the Guardia Finanza. And those guys must have done something ahead of time. They must have started working with the Bodeo, maybe in their leather work. Maybe they were using army surplus holsters and racking. There's some process by which The Guardia Financia wanted the external dimensions of this gun for sure. So that makes me think holsters. They start asking around to have these produced by the army or through the army. And in particular, they're going to Glicenti as a manufacturer. At some point, Carlo Bodeo hears of this, though, because he had only negotiated to sell this to the army and then probably some sort of side deal for Navy or anything else like that. But there was no deal for the Guardia Financia. So we actually know that Carlo Bodeo ends up in court. There's documents around this, fighting the Guardia Financia for trying to rip off his patent. Now, arguably, he wanted to have a separate contract negotiated, but it was towards the end of the life of his patent anyway. And so Guardia Financia decided to be stubborn and to not adopt the Bodeo. But something must have been in the works because they needed the outside of the Bodeo. So you get a very interesting gun. You get this guy. I mean, take a glance. That looks like a Bodeo with a trigger guard, which would have been an officer's model. And yet, if you look closely, there's a little difference here. All right, let's see what we got. Number one. Obviously, our ejector is different. It still fits down the arbor, but it's got a weird textured separate swing out system that is mounted over to the other side, much more like a tranter, sort of. It's actually a little awkward and it doesn't like to stay where it's supposed to be. If we open up the gate and we'll do, let's say we eject our case and we want to do our Abity thing, right? No, there's no Abity on this because Bodeo owned the Abity patent in Italy. Huh. Let's get a look inside. We'll just go ahead and pop this. And what Glicenti did in order to avoid Carlo Bodeo is turn back to the next gun they knew best, the Chamelot-Delvigne. We have a trigger with its spring. We have a sear with its spring. We have a hammer with its spring. We have a strut that shares a spring with the hand. This is a Chamelot-Delvigne. So that means we have an external Bodeo with internal Chamelot-Delvigne. And we have an external Chamelot-Delvigne that has become an internal Bodeo. The world is a beautiful place. I'd also like to show you that they made another improvement in here because if you check it out, single action locks on the sear, drops just like you'd expect. Double action, you push through the strut, drops like you'd expect. But did anybody catch that? You see that movement? Watch the hammer. It's rebounding. They designed a rebounding Chamelot-Delvigne, a feature that was not in the original Chamelot-Delvigne. All right, I zoomed in a little closer so you can actually see this because it's very interesting how they pulled it off. If we cock this back and let the sear lock in order to do single action fire, when we pull the trigger, it's going to tip the sear, release the hammer to fall. Boom, right? Now, the sear is also resting right up against that rebound notch in the hammer. And don't forget, this spring is pushing up on the sear. This one's pushing on the hammer. Those two are going to be brought into conflict as I release the trigger. So this wants to rise. This wants to stay fallen, but look, it's putting leverage right there. That's just enough pressure off the sear, which is the stronger spring, in order to rebound the hammer. Now that's a soft rebound. So at this point, if I push on it, I mean, it takes very little effort. So it's very softly rebounded. It's not doing much. This is where the genius comes in. If I let this guy down, eventually the strut, which was already part of the Chamlo system, is going to clear this notch on the hammer. Locked in, right? At that moment, if you think about it, this other notch here is now keeping the strut firmly this way, right? It can't rise without fighting the hammer's own spring, right? It's pushing down that way. Because it's pushing in this direction, they went ahead and put an extension off the back of the trigger here, this little lump right here, which is pushing the sear the other way. So in other words, the harder you push the strut down, the harder it's going to push the sear into the hammer, preventing it from being able to go forward. And yet, if you try to push the hammer forward right now, which I can do a tiny, tiny bit, right? When you try to push the hammer forward, like if I had dropped it, well, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to push on the strut. That pushes on the sear, that pushes back on the hammer. So in other words, any attempt to move the hammer forward puts the hammer against itself. It's a Chinese finger trap of sorts. Its own need to go forward fights it the whole way through. And this is all done just by changing the shape of the notches in the sear and adding this little bulking to the back of the trigger. And that's it. And that's how you convert a Chamelot-Delvigne into an auto-rebounding hammer-blocked system. It's genius. Nobody saw it for decades. And one fight with Carlo Bodeo, and it's in this system. is amazing. Now, these guns didn't stick around for long because eventually his patent failed and the Guardia Financia went over to using regular old Bodeos so that they could have the cheaper components and the same production as the other government agencies. But this is a unique little pistol that existed for just a short period of time. I thought you guys would like to see it. I know it isn't everyone's cup of tea, but there is something just so satisfying to me in the symmetry of having a Bodeo and a Chamlo and a Chamlo Bodeo and a Bodeo Chamlo. Anyway, y'all have a good one.